This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio. I'm David Westin. Speaker Pelosi also addressed the subject of impeachment. Was she surprised or disappointed that no Republicans went with her on the resolution? What would it look like if Vice President Pence actually become president? And can she work with President Trump even while he's investigating him for impeachment?
We have decided that we are going to support and defend the Constitution of the United States. That's the oath of office we take. For a long time, I've resisted weighing the equities of whether this was divisive for the country. But what the president did, vis-a-vis the president of Ukraine, just removed all doubt that we had to act upon that. And this is not about his personality, his policies. That's for the election. This is about the Constitution. This is about defending our democracy, which the president has said Article 2 says I can do whatever I want. It doesn't. Article 2 makes him a monarch if he interprets it that way. That's not what our founders had in mind. A republic, Benjamin Franklin said, if we can keep it. We think it's our time to keep it. You mentioned time in the beginning. We think the times have found us. Thomas Paine said at the time of the Revolution, the times have found us to declare independence, do all that our founders did. They wrote a constitution. Thank God they made it amendable so that we could expand freedom over time and continue to do so. But what the president has done is to say the three separate and co-equal branches of government, forget that. Article 2, it's about me. I can do that.
If the thing that changed is the president's dealings with the president of Ukraine that we discovered in part from that modified transcript that we got, if that's it, can you limit the inquiry going forward to that subject, or will it inevitably broaden into all sorts of other questions?
Well, that'll be up to the committees of jurisdiction. However, this was not to trivialize what the president did, because in that call, he undermined our national security by overturning, just interpreting what Congress intended in a bipartisan way to send military aid to Ukraine. And who doesn't like that? Putin. What he did in Syria, who likes that? Putin, giving him a stronger toehold in the Middle East. What he has said about the NATO and our commitment to NATO, who benefits from that? Putin. So that they're not all related to the Constitution. But the phone call did. So again, I have kind of tried to weigh the equities in all of this, not trying to avoid dividing our country further than he already has divided it, but also to we have no choice. We took an oath to protect and defend our democracy. And that is what he has made an assault on. And if the Republicans have a higher loyalty to the president than they do to their oath of office, that's their problem. But the American people, I think, don't want that. Just imagine, suppose a Democratic president emerged. Do you think those same people would want that president to say, Article 2 says I can do whatever I want? I don't think they want that. That's not a rule of law is a democracy. Rule of a person is a monarchy. We rejected that at the beginning of our country.
You served with Mike Pence when he was in the Congress before he was vice president. What would he be like as a president?
I have no idea, but this is, we haven't even made a decision to impeach. This is what an inquiry is about.
But you started a process, the logical extreme of which would be removal of the president.
Well, I don't think it's so extreme if he has violated the Constitution. But then, nonetheless, our responsibility in the House is to make a judgment about impeachment, and then that would go to the Senate, and they'd have to decide whether they're honoring their oath of office to defend our democracy. Because this is what changed everything for me. Because I don't like people wanted me to impeach President Bush for the war in Iraq. What could be worse than that? But that's about the election. It's not about the impeachment. I thought it was wrong that they impeached President Clinton. I don't like impeachment. It divides. And our founders gave us guidance. E pluribus from any one. Whatever you do, remember that we are one. And I think that is important. But what we're talking about now is taking us into a whole other class of objection to what the president has done. And there may be other, there were 11 obstruction of justice provisions in the Mueller report. Perhaps some of them will be part of this, but again, that will be part of the inquiry to see where we go.
Coming up, we're going to have more of my interview with House Speaker Pelosi. We talked about many things, including the future of USMCA, that successor to NAFTA, whether she thinks it can get it through before the election year, and whether she needs a majority of her own caucus. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio. I am David Westin. One of the things I spoke with Speaker Pelosi today earlier, it was about the USMCA, that's the successor to the NAFTA agreement, and she pointed it to that as one thing she thinks she could get done despite the impeachment proceedings. This is what she said.
We are working now on a Mexico, U.S., Canada trade agreement, and I'm optimistic that we can be successful with that.
What's keeping us from getting that done?
Well, we don't have the assurances that we need on enforcement. I myself voted for NAFTA. I had some disappointments, but one of the big disappointments is if you don't have enforcement, you are just having a conversation, nice things that are listed, but you don't have enforcement. And I think that we can come to a place on this that not only is a good trade agreement of itself, but it will be a template for good trade agreements as we go forward. So it's not just NAFTA, old NAFTA with sugar on top to say, oh, it's better. No, it has to be really better for America's workers. Again, I don't like trickle-down economics, and I don't like trickle-down trade. It's got to start with the workers.
If you got to that point, would you be willing to go forward with USMCA with a minority of your caucus, a majority of the House?
I won't have that. We are.
You have to have a majority of the Democratic caucus.
No, it's not about that. It's about having agreement on the trade agreement. It all springs from what is in the trade agreement. I have gone in the past to the floor with a minority of my members, but that's not what this is. This is about a policy that we are establishing that isn't, again, let's just to pass it, we'll pass something less than has true enforcement in it, because if you don't have enforcement, like I had the Chinese leadership in my office, and I complained to them about their dumping of rubber into our, and they said, well, when we joined the WTO, they told us we didn't have to obey those regulations. So if you don't have enforcement, real enforcement, and a commitment to honoring the agreement, we're just, again, doing a bad deal for America's workers. And by the way, workers in Mexico and Canada as well.
That was part of my interview with House Speaker Nancy Pelosi. We'll have much more coming up throughout the day on Bloomberg Television and on radio. But in the meantime, we want to check in on the markets. And for that, we want to turn to Kaylee Line. So if USMCA got passed, we know the markets will react, but it hasn't happened yet. So today, it's all about jobs.
Today, not so much. Of course, anything on trade can change on a dime or the drop of a tweet. Nonetheless, today, it really is all about that jobs report, which was significantly stronger than the market was looking for. 128,000 on payrolls, which, of course, lends credence to the idea that the consumer is still strong, still confident, and is still going to be willing to spend, which is key because they're really the pillar of the economy at this point. So that's really adding to risk on sentiment. We are off the highs of the session on equities, but the S&P 500 is still at a record, and it is really a healthy rally up for the three major averages between 0.7 and 0.9%, while you're seeing safer haven assets like bonds heading lower with 10-year yield up about 4 basis points now. And that's true at a sector level as well. I'm looking at the IMAP function on the Bloomberg. Most of the sectors are higher today. The ones that are underperforming, the only ones in the red are the defensive sectors, consumer staples, real estate, utilities, all lower, while outperforming are some of those more cyclical sectors, especially energy, which is up the better part of 2% today. Part of that is oil, risk asset also rallying, taking part in this risk on day. And then part of that is also we got pretty solid earnings from Exxon and Chevron today.
So one of the things that jumped out at me, of course, is manufacturing and the GM strike, because everybody expected this to really drag down. And in fact, there was a loss, 36,000 in manufacturing. And despite that, the overall number was so strong. So that really indicates a pretty strong economy. And
I think that's why it led to so much of surprise as well, because everybody was saying, oh, we had the GM strike, therefore the number is going to be weak. And I think to some extent that was offsetting the idea that a weak number today was going to send a terrible signal about the economy. But the fact that it came in so much stronger despite that is adding a lot to sentiment. Now, it is causing a lot of people and traders to take down their bets that the Fed is going to cut again. But today it does seem to be a case of good news is good news still. Sometimes sometimes good news can be bad news. Today it is good.
Yeah, and the bond market reacted accordingly as a practical matter. But the other thing that was interesting to me actually was the participation rate jumping up. 63.3%, which is really an indication that a lot more people are coming in off the sidelines.
Yeah, it is. And the unemployment rate, did tick up slightly, but you're also seeing solid wage gains. Of course, we need to 3.0% when we think about the Fed's inflation equation. But the fact that wage gains did go higher month on month as well, again, created this idea that the consumer is going to still be able to spend.
Well, and the big point there is its real wages are growing.
Right.
Because that 3% may not sound that high, but compared to inflation, which is below 2%, so people actually are net with having more money in their pocket.
Yeah, it's a really solid number. You're seeing the market reflect that today. And I think that's the macro picture. And then you also have some really solid earnings on the micro picture. So there's a lot of reasons for investors to be optimistic, at least on this Friday.
Yeah, there you go. I'll take
Should
it.
nothing else crazy happen with trade.
The day is still young. Okay.
It is.
Thank you so much to Bloomberg Kelly Lyons. Up next, we hear Speaker Pelosi's thoughts on the possibility of a wealth tax. Do the Democrats really want to go after the wealthy the way some candidates have indicated? Would that help with some of the problems? She talks about distribution of income and wealth across the United States. We talk about whether that would be a good move for them in 2020. That's coming up next on Bloomberg Television and on radio. From New York, this is a special edition of Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Westin. I spoke to Speaker Nancy Pelosi earlier today about exactly what the Democrats were likely to run on in 2020, and specifically, what about that wealth tax that some of the candidates have raised already? Is that really a winning proposition for them?
As I say all the time, whatever we do about our revenue, our taxation, has to be done in a bipartisan way. We have to have fairness, and we also have to have enough to run the government, but we don't want any more government than we need. And as these candidates are putting forth their ideas on these things, it's up to them to describe why that is a good thing and how that will help grow the economy. But I do think that I would enlarge the issue to talk about how do we conduct our meeting the needs of the American people in a way that does not increase the deficit, that does increase job creation and have growth that creates job creation for good paying jobs. And we think that growing the infrastructure of America is a path to get that done, to do it. And I would like it in a green way. We'll see what the president would be willing to do, but there's plenty of area of common ground for us to do that, because what we want to do is increase the paychecks. And again, however it is paid for, that's a negotiation. You talk about growth, which is terribly important, because if there's more for everyone will do better, we hope. President Trump ran basically on a pro-growth policy, and he did deliver tax cuts, what everyone thinks about them. A tax scam that benefited 83% of the benefits benefit the top 1% in our country. But it increased the GDP growth for a period of time at least. We're at 2%, and unemployment's at a 50-year low. If you were a Trump voter in one of those key districts in 2016, what in 2020 is going to cause you to say, you know what, I'm going to switch to a democratic approach to growth in this country? Well, let me just say this about your characterization. To the average working person, what we consider, what I proposed as indicators, where the stock market is, where the GDP is, that isn't necessarily resonating with them. They want to know why their wages are stagnating. The unemployment rate, that's interesting, and that's important. But what we're talking about is growing the paycheck, reducing the cost of health care, growing the paycheck, because our economy will grow better if people have consumer confidence and they spend and they inject demand into the economy, which further creates jobs, not about some indicators that may or may not relate to their lives. So let's take apart what it means that when you say the GDP is higher, and why and in what respect. I think the president's tax bill, in the dark of night and the speed of light, with many mistakes, benefiting the top 1%, 83% of the benefits, down 1%, was a scam. And now they're coming to us to say, you have to help us correct all the mistakes that we made in it. So we will try to work together to help with some of the technical corrections, seeing what we can get for America's working families. as we do that. But it is, it's just not, you shouldn't do a tax bill of that magnitude without it being bipartisan.
Let's talk about what the alternative is, a Democratic alternative that will have growth for everyone, where the workers will participate as well. We hear a lot of proposals, and it's not just a wealth tax, other proposals as well, taxation things, that seem to have some Democrats running against big business, against big tech. They want to break it up, against big wealth. Is that a winning strategy for the Democrats in 2020?
Well, they're different categories. I mean, again, when we want to grow our economy, when I send my members to a discussion, as we have in the past, about the budget and how we reduce the budget, the deficit, the national debt, I always say to them the following: just put in the middle of the table growth. Growth. And what proposals do people have to grow the economy, to create good paying jobs, and not adding to the national debt? Because it's poisonous into all the debt service that we have to pay for tax cuts for the rich. So so that is, I said, be agnostic. Wherever the solution comes from, the right, the left, wherever it comes, be agnostic. It doesn't matter the provenance. What matters is the result for the American people. So one of our main initiatives on the growth area is to, in a significant way, address the infrastructure needs in our country. There are trillions of dollars of deficit, and that's where we need to invest in that in a way that creates good paying jobs for the American people, and those jobs are here. I do think that certain things are inevitable, globalization, innovation, and the rest, and we should be thinking of what does that mean in the lives of the average American worker, and not make decisions that are separate from bubble up, not trickle down.
That was Speaker of the House Nancy Pelosi on the subject of big wealth and how to grow the economy. In the meantime, I also talked to her about exactly what her relationship with Donald Trump is right now, what it can be if she's investigating for impeachment. We're going to cover that next. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio. I'm David Westin. Speaker Pelosi also talked to me about her relationship with Donald Trump, the man and the president, given the fact that they had a meltdown in their last meeting, and she actually is investigating for impeachment. This is what she said.
Well, we always want the President of the United States to succeed. That's just the way it is. The election happens, you want the President to succeed. But if he doesn't really believe in governance, it's hard to get to a place where we have a results-oriented proposal to go forward. But he has said that he does want to reduce the cost of prescription drugs. And he puts out stuff that isn't, we'll find a common ground. I think we can. He has said that he wants to build the infrastructure of America. Almost every conversation I've ever had with him up until recently has been about included infrastructure. So I think in those two, our three things were lower cost of prescription drugs, bigger paychecks by building the infrastructure, and cleaner government. I don't think he's interested in that.
Well, you said until recently there was that infamous now meltdown, people call it, meeting at the White House. Have you talked to the president since then?
No.
Do you intend to? I mean, how can you reestablish relationships with this man after some of the things that have happened in the White House?
Well, we are working with the administration and the trade representative on the Mexico Free Trade Agreement, working with his people on what we can do about the prescription drug bill, and we work with him and the Republicans on doing our appropriations bills, which is what we have to do right now, is pass the appropriation bill. And we have some obstacles to getting that done. But in those rooms are the House, Senate, and the White House as part of those negotiations. We don't have to be the ones talking all the time. There's a lot of work that the staff can do. And I'm an appropriator. That's the culture I was forged in Congress. Two places: intelligence and appropriations. And I know, left to their own devices, the appropriators, Democrats and Republicans working together, can bring us to a place that can keep government open. On intelligence, however, though, when the president called and told me how perfect his conversation was, I said, Mr. President, you're into my wheelhouse now. This is not perfect. This is perfectly wrong. And that was that conversation. That preceded the meeting at the White House.
That's Nancy Pelosi, the Speaker of the House, talking about her relationship with President Trump. And now let's bring in Craig Gordon. He's Bloomberg News Washington bureau chief and executive editor. So welcome, Craig. It was interesting listening to her. Doesn't seem to be a big rush to get back in touch with Donald Trump, the man.
Yeah, I think you kind of come away from your interview, and we talked to her a little bit ourselves on the news side, too, that she's sort of like offended. That's like my word, but like that, this is Nancy Pelosi. She's devoted her entire life to public service, to government, believes in government, the good the government can do. And here's a guy, as she said, who doesn't actually believe in that and doesn't think he has to follow the rules or the Constitution. And I just think there's some part of her that can't entirely process that you could have a person sitting in the Oval Office who feels that way. So yes, I think she's quite happy to do her thing up in the Congress, and Trump can do his thing on the side.
Can that work in Washington? If we had a situation where the Speaker of the House was not speaking to the President of the United States and they got work done?
Well, in the same interview that where she spoke to Bloomberg News, she talked about very encouragingly about USMCA, the replacement for NAFTA. I mean, she basically said it would be the easiest trade deal to get done. She's eager to get a vote, scheduled. So, obviously the Congress would sign it, the Congress would pass it, the president would sign it. So that's something they could do. Lowering drug prices seems to be a little bit of a place of agreement. So there is a personal and a professional side of this, and if she can get some legislation done that her folks can run on in 2020. I think she'd be quite happy to do that.
We also have Anna Edgerton with us here. She's our Congress editor down in Washington. So, and it did strike me, to pick up on what Craig was saying, that this seems to be a shift on her part. In the past, she'd had tussles with the President of the United States, but, let's pray for him, and, I can get along with him, I can work with him. This time she said, I'm not talking to him. We can talk to his people. I'll deal with his people, not with him.
Exactly, and that's a really good point, that her staff is still talking to White House staff. So when it comes to things like USMCA, the United States Trade Representative Lighthizer is talking with Democrats about this. So there's still negotiations going on, even if it's not at that top level. There will be other areas where she'll have to negotiate things that the president will have to sign.
The other thing, just to pick up on USMCA and the discussion with her, I found interesting was she thinks she's going to get it done. They're close to it. They have to enforcement. When I said, will you do it without the majority of your caucus? She said no. She said, I have done that in other legislation. I won't do that here. I have a majority, which may not speak well for the chances of USMCA. She's got to bring her whole caucus along.
That's a really good point. And what's one of the things we were trying to realize is her threshold for Democratic support a majority of the caucus? Does she want to get to 218 votes to be able to demonstrate that they can pass this on their own? One thing that she told us is that they have shared values with labor, with the other kind of outside groups that want to get this passed. So there is a path forward to getting to yes on this.
She also talks about a prescription drug bill, and the president wants that done. Is that doable? I mean, you know Congress well. Do you think that's realistic?
Well, I would always roll my eyes whenever someone would say we're going to do bipartisan infrastructure, but drug pricing is one place where President Trump actually sounds more like a Democrat. So the people that we need to bring along on drug pricing might be Chuck Grassley, the Senate Finance Chairman.
Craig, in listening to the Speaker, there's all sorts of things she thinks she can get done, USMCA, drug pricing, things like that. As a practical matter, is Washington just going to be consumed with impeachment? We're going to have public hearings now coming up fairly soon. As a practical matter, that's going to take an awful lot of the oxygen out of the room.
Yeah, you have impeachment, which she broke the news with us today that she expects public hearings to start sometime this month, the next few weeks or so. You've also got a small little thing called the Iowa caucuses on February 3rd. So you have an impeachment, you have a presidential election, and you have Donald Trump. So progress, boy, if they could do it, then they're more than I would expect at this point. But it does, deadlines focus the mind in Washington, and maybe those things she might jam the new NAFTA through, or a couple of these things just to get it in under the wire.
Yeah. Many thanks to Craig Gordon and Anna Edgerton joining us from Washington today. It's our pleasure. And now we're going to be playing much more of the interview with Speaker Pelosi throughout the day and the weekend on Bloomberg Television and Radio. Coming up here, Bailey Hutchison. She is U.S. Ambassador to NATO, and she's going to talk about Syria, Turkey, and much, much more. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Westin. Bailey Hutchison is the 22nd United States Permanent Representative to NATO, a position she took after serving her home state of Texas in the United States Senate for 20 years. Welcome her now back to Bloomberg. Great to have you here in New York.
I'm so glad to be on set for a change.
This is a
I
treat.
get to talk to you across the pond, but this is great.
This is terrific. So you've just come from a defense ministers meeting of NATO. Tell us what was on that agenda, what was important for the United States and for NATO.
Well, most certainly our defense ministers that meet 3 times a year were talking about the Syria situation, and everyone is very concerned that that is now in a state of flux and everyone's watching it. We're talking about Afghanistan. We are also talking about the new things that we're going to do. We're looking at determining space as an area in which we will be able to operate. Looking at all the new kinds of technology that is now in defense and security is mind-boggling.
So let's take in that order. Let's start with Syria. A lot of developments in Syria, both of the United States pulling back, the Turks coming across for that safety zone, and then, of course, the killing of Baghdadi, a very big development. Is Syria a safer place today than it was a month ago, or is it about the same?
Well, David, compared to a month ago, I would say it's about the same. It's a very volatile situation, there's no doubt about it, and we're all the defense ministers were very insistent that we need to try to bring certainly down the violence. We need to assure that ISIS is still on our radar as an adversary. And the killing of Baghdadi was certainly a major feat, but we all know that ISIS could resurrect and it could attack us in America. It could attack any of our allies in Europe. And so we are going to be very vigilant. The ministers are going to continue to work in the de-ISIS framework, which we have in Syria, in Iraq. And the de-ISIS coalition is bigger than even NATO. There are a lot of partners in the de-ISIS coalition because it has been a treacherous terrorist group, and we want to make sure that it doesn't rise again with some new leader.
With the U.S. pulling forces back, and they were modest forces to begin with, but pulling forces back, does somebody else need to step into that role, specifically with respect to Islamic State?
Well, I think certainly our allies are looking at how they can be helpful. We now know that Russia is part of the safe zone, and we were able to work within that framework to get the Baghdadi issue settled. And I think that it is going to take more than just Russia and just Turkey and just Syria. We want this to go to a peace settlement in Geneva. That's what we're all for. We want Syria to have a government that will accommodate its minorities, including the Kurds, and have a form of human rights in that country. And so the long-term goal is the peace agreement that would include all parties and be done in Geneva.
Who has the most leverage right now to bring about that agreement or a negotiation toward that agreement? Is it Russia? Is it Vladimir Putin as a practical matter?
David, that is a really good question. And I would say Russia is a key player, no doubt about it. Turkey is a key player, but so are the European nations. France is in there. We are still in there. We are very much a part of making sure that ISIS does not rise again. That's why we were there in the first place. It's why we are going to still have some capabilities there to assure that ISIS doesn't rise in some part of Syria and come back and do its terrorist acts against any of our allies or ourselves.
We're talking with Bailey Hutchison. She is the U.S. ambassador to NATO. You mentioned Turkey, Madam Ambassador. Obviously, there were some strains on the relationship, I think it's fair to say, between the United States and Turkey over that building of the safe zone. Is that all patched? What is our relationship like with Turkey, and how is it functioning within NATO, within the alliance?
Well, Turkey is a very valuable NATO ally. They are one of the key leaders in Afghanistan. We work with Turkey on so many levels, but the key area now with Turkey is the Russian missile defense system that they are looking like they're going to put in Ankara, and we are very much against that. The allies are against it because if you have a Russian missile defense system, in a NATO country, then that's going to affect interoperability of all of NATO. So we're trying to work with Turkey to see if we can have some other way for them to get the security that they need. We have offered Patriot missiles. We've offered even some of the other European missile systems for defense. So we're still working. We haven't given up, but it's essential that we don't have a Russian missile defense system.
Well, that's fascinating because that was an issue some 6 months ago or so, and I had the impression that horse was sort of out of the barn, to use an expression we used to use in Michigan, maybe used it in Texas as well. It's not out of the barn? Can that be turned around?
It can be. It is still it's still going to be a heavy lift to do it because they are taking parts of it in Turkey now. They are training troops to try to deploy it, but it isn't deployed yet. When it is deployed, there will be sanctions that are already passed by Congress that you can't buy military equipment from Russia. That's our major adversary right now. And we've got to work with Turkey to try to get them the security they need, which we absolutely understand. They have a right to their sovereignty and their security, but we can't do it with this kind of program. So it isn't totally out of the barn. We're still hoping to be able to keep that door open.
We're talking with Bailey Hutchison. She is our U.S. ambassador to NATO. You can't get NATO together without talking about contributions from the respective governments. A big issue for President Trump. There's a goal there that people are supposed to meet. Some people have met it. I understand more people have met it over the last few years than before, but we still have a ways to go.
We do.
Where are we on that?
Well, we're going in the right direction, but we're not where we need to be. We do have every country now stepping up more. Every country has reversed and going in the right direction, and it's to the amount of over $100 billion by the end of this year, more than in 2016. So in 2 years, well, 3 years, we have made great strides, but we're not nearly where we need to be. And let me just explain, David, that we're talking about the capabilities to address the risks that we face. And the risk of Russia, the risk of a rising China that is also looking like it's more military oriented. We've got to have the cash and the capabilities to gear up against that. And the 2% was decided in 2014 as what we needed. So it's not like we've chosen it to come out of the air. It is what we think we need in submarines, in tanks, in aircraft, in missile defense systems to be able to deter Russia, not think that they can ever come into Europe and take over a sovereign country again, and also to prepare for a rising China.
Once again, we're talking with Bailey Hutchison. She's our U.S. ambassador to NATO. Why don't they get there? Let's pick on Germany just for a moment, because President Trump has identified that. They have said they want to. It's their goal to get there. There are a lot of people who are economists say they'd be better off spending some more money, the German government. So why don't they just do it? What's keeping them from doing it?
You know, the Germans have a divided government. They have a partnership rather than a clear chancellor. She had to get in partners. So some of them don't want defense spending. It's amazing to us because we would think that because they're the best economy in Europe, that they would be able to do more. Well, we know they are able to. They are stepping up. The new defense minister of Germany has said that they will go for the 2%. They're going in the right direction, but not nearly as fast as we hope that they will.
Still on your to-do list. Okay, many thanks to our ambassador to NATO. She is Ambassador Bailey Hutchison, coming visiting us from Brussels. Coming up, Balance of Power continues on Bloomberg Radio. In our second hour, more of my interview with House Speaker Nancy Pelosi. Plus, we're going to be airing a special program of my conversation with the Speaker this weekend across all Bloomberg platforms. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio.